Greetings from sunny Brussels, everyone, and good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from. I'm Bruno Lété, a senior fellow with the German Marshall Funds here in Brussels. I'm very glad indeed that we have this conversation today on policies and priorities to adapt NATO to an age of technological innovation. In this light, let me also immediately thank our partners in this initiative for their support, the United States mission to NATO. So perhaps a few words on why we are together today. I realize that all eyes are on Ukraine for obvious reasons, but that doesn't take away that there's also other important issues that deserve our attention. NATO is not only heading for another summit next June in Madrid, but the alliance is also rewriting a new strategic concept, which will set out allied strategy for the coming years to come. I would argue this is a very welcome move, given that the latest strategic concept dates back from 2010. So the world has changed tremendously indeed since then. And of course, one of those drivers of change is innovation. Technologies are disrupting the global strategic balance, and they also impact how we organize our armed forces. So NATO is facing a need to facilitate technological cooperation, but also speed up the adoption of next-gen tech. Without investing in technology, the alliance's resilience and its ability to deter would of course be put seriously at risk. So this is of course a huge task engulfing many different domains and disciplines. Think about the role of cloud, 5G, AI, robotization, machine learning. These are all technologies that are becoming unavoidable factors in NATO's 5 operational domains: land, sea, air, cyber, and space. So I think what we want to achieve today is understanding a little bit better how NATO deals with these issues and see how they should be addressed in the new strategic concept, but perhaps also look at ways how NATO can facilitate R&D cooperation, not only between the member states, but also how to work best with other sectors, such as the private sector or academia. So these are a little bit the topics that I had in mind for this conversation. So fortunately, I'm joined by a delightful panel of experts and practitioners to answer these difficult questions, and let me briefly introduce them to you. Raluca Csernatoni, a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe, welcome. Joanna van der Merwe, who is a fellow for the Defense Tech Initiative at CEPA. I hope I pronounced the family name correctly. Nikolas Ott is a project manager for cybersecurity and digital diplomacy at Microsoft. Welcome indeed. And last but not least, Moritz Zimmermann, a program officer in the NATO Innovation Unit at HQ here in Brussels. So thanks again to all of you for joining. Please know that we are on the record. I'll invite each one of you to give some short comments first, and then we'll turn to the audience for comments and Q&A. So if you, the audience, have things to say, please use the chat function or the Q&A function in Zoom. I'm sure that we are all aware how these things work now after 2 years of online conferencing. So just to get started, I turn to you, Moritz, perhaps to give us a bit of a bird's-eye overview of ongoing efforts at NATO to make sure our armed forces are technologically up to date, and perhaps also, if you could explain to us how big of a priority this will be for the new strategic concept.
Thank you so much, Bruno, and an absolute pleasure being with all of you this afternoon or morning, depending from where we're dialing into this webinar. Indeed, I work for NATO's Innovation Unit, and the unit was created only 3 years ago. And we've really been tasked to look at this new wave of technological developments from a strategic perspective. So this new wave of technological developments have been framed as emerging and disruptive technologies here at NATO, and have been defined particularly with 7 key technology areas of importance to the alliance. So we're looking at artificial intelligence, big data, autonomous technologies, quantum technologies, biotechnologies, human enhancement, space, and probably I forgot one. I think what's really clear is when we're looking at these technologies is they have a tremendous amount of applicability in a military and defense environment. We can use AI tools for situational awareness, autonomous technologies for logistic tools, or sensors such as biosensors or quantum sensors for precise navigation and timing. The prism or the perspective we've taken here at NATO when looking at these technologies is that these technologies will be key and fundamental to ensure technological superiority, the technological edge of our armed forces. And this technological edge in turn is really the backbone for our effective deterrence and defense posture. So this obviously makes innovation and new technologies extremely critical for the new strategic concept, as NATO will have to position itself in this kind of really changing security and defense environment. I think if we look at all of these technologies, one thing that they have in common, one challenge they have in common, is that the development of these technologies is not driven by the defense industry anymore. It's very much driven by the civilian private sector, by startups, by big technology companies, by companies and entities that we as a defense and security environment are not used to really engage with. We work on procurement contracts that take years and years. We work on millions of euros and dollars, whereas startups need very short-term contracts with maybe small amounts of money to actually keep them running and be able to engage with them. So that's the main challenge, therefore, is for us not very much the kind of development of these technologies. I think we can build on really fantastic ecosystems within the alliance. The challenge is the adoption of these technologies into our armed forces. This is what we're struggling with on an alliance level. And I will be very short now and just giving you a quick overview of what we're looking at, what the kind of the main work strands are within the alliance. You can really, in oversimplifying it a little bit, you can separate it in two different work strands. One's the strategic work strand and one the operational kind of mechanism-oriented work strand. Let me start with the strategic one. It's absolutely clear that as an alliance, we'll have to define our strategic positioning towards these technologies. And there are different fields that we'll have to tackle as we talk about these changes that are necessary. We'll have to be talking about human capital. We will have to retain, recruit the right talent. We'll have to be talking about data. How do we share, exploit, and analyze data sets that are collected throughout the alliance and really make the most out of it, put it at disposal of our developers to make sure that the solutions that are being developed are applicable for us and of use for us. The third element I would highlight here, and also the last element on the strategic approach, is the importance of principles of responsible use. NATO needs to establish itself as a responsible user of these technologies. This is absolutely critical, not only to build trust amongst allies, but also with our operators and also with the developers of these technologies. And I think, let me just highlight one point here. I think it's critical that NATO takes a proactive stance here and is actually ahead of the civilian debate when it comes to the responsible use of these technologies. And this brings me to the second kind of main work strand that we've taken, and that's the operational aspects of it all. It is clear that as we're looking at maintaining the alliance's technological edge, we will have to re-engage with civilian innovators in a different way. We'll have to introduce our military problem sets to an ecosystem that has never before worked with the military environment. And this is why at the summit last year, allies decided to launch two extremely exciting initiatives that really keep me awake at night now for the last couple of months already. And this is the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic and the NATO Innovation Fund. Both will be established in time for the next summit, and both aim at equipping the alliance with the necessary mechanisms to drive effective engagement with the civilian innovation ecosystem and introduce problem sets to these world-leading developers. The Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, or Joanna, will be capitalizing on a network of accelerator sites and test centers to work together with startups, whereas the NATO Innovation Fund will invest into deep tech, breakthrough technologies, and provide them with patient capital to develop the technologies further and also bring them into the hands of allied warfighters. So I would stop here. I would maybe just say that all of these are obviously work in progress, and I'm very much looking forward to the whole discussion. And looking forward to exchanging with all of you. Thank you very much.
No, Maurice, that's great, and thank you very much, for getting to the point. And there's some interesting things there that you said that I would like to follow up with maybe after the first round of interventions. That leads me next to Nikolas Ott. So, Maurice just explained to us also that, the private sector plays an important role in innovation. You are the trendsetters in a way. There's already a lot out there. I mean, NATO has an industry advisory board, for instance, and we just hear Maurice explain the new initiatives are in the making. So how, from a private sector, I mean, what added value you think from a private sector can you bring to NATO?
Sure. Thank you, Bruno, and thanks for having me here today with all of you. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all of our audience. Before I answer your question, Bruno, allow me to just touch upon three themes in my opening remarks here that I think are sort of a good way to frame some of the challenges and opportunities that we face. One are cyber threat intelligence, two is NATO industry cooperation at large, and three are strategic implications of EDTs, for example, on AI or cloud adoption. Of course, we've mentioned it that, the Ukraine crisis is on top of mind of all of us, but it also reinforced the understanding for the alliance to have a robust cyber capability, SEC, and the technology is really transforming defense as well as other aspects of society as we speak right now. And this is exactly why companies like the one I represent here today is helping to address those shared challenges of adaptation. We continue to monitor closely what's happening in Ukraine and are committed to protecting our customers and society at large against malicious cyber attacks and, of course, active disinformation campaigns. Our policy is when we see things, we say it, like in January when we discovered destructive malware in Ukrainian government systems. Our detection and reporting of this shows that's why it's important to consider private sector insights on defense-related tech developments and situational cyber threat awareness. This can be a substantive component of maintaining NATO's tech and military edge, as Moritz just outlined in his initial remarks. But as this trend develops, as it is likely to do, it will require a change of mentality in the part of both sides, tech companies and NATO, and of course its allies, around strategic collaboration and what that really means for all of us. And this brings me to my second point here on the long-term thinking around NATO industry cooperation. Because there's a responsibility on really sort of both parties here on making sure that we continue defending and assuring Western democratic principles and values. And that really brings and connects me to what Moritz has been saying about, having a responsible set of frameworks when we're talking about EDTs at large. It's great to see NATO take steps into that direction. And it's really important that I think we talk about how we can do this jointly to make sure that these guidelines are adaptable and implementable both within NATO, but of course also with potential supporters and entities that will work with NATO. Another point relates to dialogue with industry in general, because this dialogue really goes both ways, but in a way I would only caution that this cannot easily be modeled in the kind of industry dialogues that NATO has had in the past. Mostly these were with tech defense contractors that often had no clients other than national defense ministries. Moritz alluded to long, complex procurement processes. Yes, indeed. Because when we look at today's environment, a lot of the relevant tech here is developed in large tech companies that began and still remain consumer focused. And it's that consumer focus that defines the company's culture as well. It clearly doesn't make us natural warriors in that sense. So in that case, we really need to adapt sort of our new role in the defense environment, and that will require sort of a cultural change on both sides, as well as understand the way in which both industry and NATO dialogue is structured. Let me transition to the third point that's really about the strategic importance of getting this right in terms of transitioning. We see the new ADT ambitions, the AI strategy, and other components within NATO to showcase that these pieces play a fundamental and crucial role in the transition towards sort of a new generation of NATO, so to say. And I think the NATO 2030 report goes into lengths and details with this and gives some great ideas. But I mean, quite frankly, adopting these new technologies is not easy for the defense environment. And it actually changed with the minds and the culture of that very core place, not necessarily with the tech itself. We see that NATO is striving for that with its process right now, but to really leverage emerging disruptive technologies fully, it might require even more awareness raising among policymakers on what EDTs really are, what they really mean, what kind of security implications they have when being adopted. We see this discussion in public quite extensively when it comes to cloud adoption. There's a lot that needs to be addressed so that decisions can be based on fact-based knowledge on technologies, to really then go into a decision-making process and say, is it worth for us to consider a cloud first policy? How do we embrace digitalization across the entire NATO ecosystem? How do we best categorize and store data in a structured way that Moritz had alluded to? And this really goes towards changing the institutional mindset and embrace the power of data across NATO. This is something where I think we can see also potential cooperation with the European Union, as it is one of the powerhouses on regulation on these pieces. And I think NATO could tap into the EU-NATO collaboration and engagement here to see what that really means for that engagement. And we, of course, here at Microsoft stand ready to be a trusted partner as well in this endeavor and offer reflection on our own development processes, like when we developed our Office for Responsible AI. So let me quickly wrap up here. Because in a way, when we look at this expansion of dual use goods and see Diana, see the NATO Innovation Fund, it is difficult to argue that the tech industry is sort of a neutral player in defense and security. But as providers for dual use tech, we need to make sure that we front load any developments of products and services with the evaluation of their impact of society, economics, defense, security, international law. And that really goes hand in hand with what Moritz had said, that they want to be ahead of the curve with their own framing and norming setting to make sure that they know how to best incorporate these technologies. But this is actually something that I think we need to do together collectively to really leverage the perspective both from industry, civil society, and NATO at large. So with that, back to you, Bruno, and thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Nikolas, for some very clear thoughts. And I took note of some of the things you said, and I think I will get back to you, Moritz, later on to perhaps answer to some of these things that were just said. But before we do that, I'll let you, some time also to think about that. And I would like to move on to Raluca. Welcome again to you as well. So I was hoping, dear Raluca, that we could also talk a little bit about the geopolitical dimension of these technologies. Everywhere in the world, we see that military R&D budgets are on the rise, not in the least in China and Russia. So is NATO still technologically advanced compared to those that wish to challenge the alliance, or are we losing our technological edge?
Thank you very much, Bruno. I will leave that question also open, as I am sure my fellow panelists have some insights on that. But it is a pleasure to join my fellow panelists for this timely discussion. And well, I will jump right into my talk and kind of zoom out from a bit from NATO and focus indeed on technological innovation and geopolitics, as you, Bruno, suggested. So in my view, technology has the power actually nowadays to make politics seem almost obsolete, and slow, and by extension also geopolitics, because the speed of technological advancements nowadays kind of leaves governments and international organizations looking slow, clumsy, and reactive. And this is something that is indeed a challenge, and this is mostly related to this notion of technological disruption and the speed of technological innovation. This speed can also make political, strategic, and military thinking look, I would say, tame, again, slow by comparison with some of the big ideas that we see coming out of the tech industry. And by contrast, I would also say that the tech industry or the tech world seems to look dynamic, flexible, and exciting. And we see also governments and international organizations such as the European Union and NATO trying to spin in that flexibility and adaptation when it comes to their decision-making, policy proposals, and also regulatory proposals when it comes to the governance of technological innovation. But the tech world, I would say, in its relentless search for new ideas, sometimes is unencumbered actually by this bureaucratic policy, political thinking and decisions. And this is why some critical voices or expert voices have pointed out that, you know, to do politics or policy, it seems also reactive. And we are reactive as in terms of governing some of the exciting technological innovations that we are seeing. And these have been pointed out already by Moritz and Nikolas when it comes to artificial intelligence. But yes, new ideas are exciting, but and fast technological innovation is exciting. And now we are also kind of moving into the realm of science fiction when it comes to intelligent machines, lethality engendered by autonomous weapon system, for instance, but other technological areas such as quantum-enabled technologies, a new space race. I don't know, we can again present a laundry list of exciting technological fields that might be interesting for both the civilian and military domains. But my question here, and I'm trying to be a bit provocative, is such unencumbered or unfettered and speedy technological innovation even possible, for instance, for governments and international organizations such as NATO? And to move this question even forward, is this technological innovation actually desirable, especially when it comes to new and emerging weapons technologies? So in a way, this is why we are witnessing a sense of urgency and the current fierce arms race and geopolitical competition between major powers to achieve this edge in the battlefield of today and of tomorrow, because there is this desire to catch up, to be in line with exciting technological innovations. But I would say that what we are witnessing goes beyond the traditional arms race that sometimes we like to read in geopolitical books or strategic studies reports. What is new actually with this technological innovation race is that it indeed cuts across civil and military fields, with emphasis here again on the civilian domain, where the exciting innovation and I would say also the big budgets are happening. So this race, I would say, is moving beyond pure power projection in the traditional military sense, also power generation, as well as building, for instance, deterrence posture, as Moritz was mentioning. It moves beyond because it also encompasses future societal and economic resilience. As this is what is actually the power of current technological innovation and the fusion of all these emerging technologies, and also the potential to harness their dual use applicability for both the civil and military domains. So for this instance, and this has been also mentioned by Nikolas and Moritz, important advancements in enabling and dual use AI systems have both civil and military uses. The challenge, I would say here, and this is also echoed by my previous speakers, is that how to address actually differing and sometimes conflicting research and innovation cultures between the civil and military domains, as well as the civilian private sector, I would say, as well as their innovation logics and push to the market to certain products. Because, for instance, spinning in civilian innovation, tech innovation into the military domain is not that straightforward. As Nikolas pointed out, strategic cooperation between the civil and military domains needs to be sought after at the both ends of these sectors. But when it comes to the political military organizations such as NATO, I would say that the challenges are indeed at this very core of meeting at the, I would say, intersection or a crossroads of these fields, especially when it comes to entering the exciting technological innovation field of dual use, high tech, for instance. And for this reason, of course, focusing especially on dual-use emerging disruptive technologies, dual-use technologies that also Moritz pointed out, is something that is at the core of the alliance need for security resilience, as well as more broadly in terms of redefining also its relevance as a military alliance, especially in the face of highly networked, increasingly automated, hybrid, and flash types of flash warfare types of threats, emerging security threats, both in the real and virtual world, as also Nikolas pointed out, by cybersecurity, emerging cybersecurity threats. So I would say that at the time of geopolitical strategic challenges and the fast speed of technological advancements, NATO is indeed at a critical point. Focusing on high-tech dual-use technological innovation is one way ahead to adapt to these challenging times. However, I would say this is not enough in an asymmetrical world, which also presents a lot of challenges when it comes to strategic thinking, political and geopolitical disruptions. There needs also to be more flexibility when it comes to mindsets. And I'm glad that Nikolas also brought this into the discussion. Strategic cultures and mindsets, flexibility and adaptability in terms of operational and strategic command structures is also highly needed. So when it comes to innovation and disruption, this doesn't necessarily need to happen only in the technological field, but also when it comes to institutional and organizational structures that need to be ready to deploy advanced technologies by also proposing interoperability when it comes to forces, for instance, as well as continued training and exercises. But this brings me to my last point. Of course, the greatest responsibility of the alliance is to protect and defend, territories, populations against emerging threats, and to address these threats, including by promoting, technological innovation. But to reiterate Moritz's and Nikolas' points, NATO also has a responsibility to uphold its international commitments and to act responsibly in the international system when it comes to the research, development, and deployment of emerging disruptive technologies, especially in terms of promoting a responsible and ethical governance of defense innovation. Because I would say that through the adoption of responsible innovation and uses, NATO and allies can send some deliberative messages to both its allies, but also other states when it comes to, democratic commitments to technological innovation. So I'll stop here and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Raluca, for your elaborate thoughts, but necessary indeed to understand the context of it all. Joanna, well, there's perhaps something enjoyable going as the last one on the panel because all the other speakers have revealed their cards and you can perhaps comment on everything that was said, but how do you, see things from your perspective? I mean, in terms of innovation, how do you assess current trends?
Yeah, thanks, Bruno, and thanks for having me. It is always fun going last because everybody's already said all my points for me, so I get to just respond. I think it is promising, and I think one of the most promising things I've seen from NATO when it comes to innovation is the setting up of this innovation fund. I think innovation funds are key to supporting fast and agile innovation projects, and obviously Diana as well. But I think really the devil is always in the details on how you're actually going to implement it. And what I find interesting is understanding which projects will be receiving funding. What are the criteria upon which innovation fund projects will be selected, and which ones will be selected for the accelerator? Because when we speak about tech innovation, the focus from what I've seen and having spent most of my career doing tech innovation and specifically integration of tech into organizations, is that the kinds of projects that are not prioritized in innovation funds are those that are not necessarily focused on the development of the tech. So, for example, a project that I worked on was specifically focused on how do we innovate policy. From a tech innovation fund, the project had nothing to do with tech. I didn't touch a piece of technology. I didn't do any coding. I specifically focused on, okay, what does it mean policy-wise, and what are the new ways in which we need to build policy development processes, but also feedback loops. What do they need to look like? So it really is in the details that we're going to see whether this innovation fund and Diana really do bring NATO forward when it comes to tech innovation. Yeah, and it's really promising to already hear Maurits talk about the problem set that will be presented, because I think with the changing of the dynamic between who drives technological development from it used to be military to now the private sector, I think as Nikolas also pointed out, you have people developing tech who don't necessarily have the military knowledge that it used to be, and how you present those problem sets to the developers is key, because I really think there is a risk of open-ended technology demonstrations without strategic clarity from NATO or from leadership of the military, runs the risk that we're developing capabilities based off of what non-military experts think is relevant versus what the military experts really do. And I think there needs to be a very clear operational return of investment for armed forces when it comes to this. And I think US Air Force Secretary, I'm going to get his name wrong, Frank Kendall, he did last year announced a complete overhaul of their advanced battle management system because of the fact that he expressed that he wasn't sure that the operational problems were clear, and they need to solve them and then see what the proposed solutions will be. And that way of thinking really needs to be scaled up, and everybody needs to be trained in how to think from that problem set point of view. And that's not something that's limited to NATO or limited to the military. That is something that you're seeing across all sectors, is that the strategic decisions are sometimes being driven by what the technology is and not the other way around, which is quite problematic. But I'd also like to respond a bit quickly to the idea of responsibility and how to be a leader when it comes to responsible tech. And I think one of the words that is always left out when it's responsible is responsible and accountable. And we have a severe challenge when it comes to how do we actually do accountability. And everybody knows the thing of who's attributable for the flaw in the system. But it's also, we already have accountability issues when it comes to upholding democratic values. You're seeing that pushed to the limits when it comes to political level in the EU with Poland and Hungary. You're seeing our accountability mechanisms being challenged. And so the question is will they withstand what we're expecting when it comes to these new technologies? Are they appropriate, and how will we do it? And that needs to be discussed long before you're even implementing them in the battlefield. You also need accountability when you're talking about testing and evaluation, because mistakes can happen in testing as well. And there needs to be some form of accountability there. And that also is foundational for trust. You're asking populations to trust their militaries, trust NATO with highly lethal emerging technologies. And if you can't demonstrate an appropriate accountability mechanism, what are you asking them to trust it on? And that's something that will always be a challenge. We know that the fog of war is the fog of war for a reason, but we have military tribunals. There are ways in which we hold human soldiers accountable for their actions. So that also needs to be updated, and we need to look at how those rules apply to these new technologies. And then just to respond to one other about the technological superiority. When I worked with the Dutch Ministry of Defense, this is a question that I specifically looked at as to whether artificial intelligence poses a threat to the technological superiority of the Western nations. And one of the things that's overlooked is our superiority is not necessarily because of the technology. The superiority of NATO forces when it comes to engaging on the battlefield is because our humans have an education system. They have critical thinking, they have creative thinking. The culture with which we educate our soldiers is one of the things that allows them to creatively think on the battlefield, which is one of the foundational elements to being a successful soldier. So to overlook that when we're focused on funding technology and not fund the equivalent improvement of human creativity, human education, will fundamentally undermine the superiority as it is. The technology on its own won't be implemented. We'll always have humans implementing it on the battlefield, and we'll always be trying to implement it in a way that's unpredictable to the opponent. And that unpredictability is reliant on creativity. And I can respond to all of Raluca's questions, but I don't want to take up all the time now. So I'll let us go to conversation for now.
Joanna, thank you very much. And I appreciate that, you also refer to the human factor here. and the need to also invest in skills and talent. AI on itself will not do the trick. So I will open the Q&A and the comments. So to our digital viewers, please do post your questions. I will monitor the Q&A feed very closely. But while you are posting your comments, let me perhaps return to you, Moritz, as promised. I'd love to have your reactions to some of the things that were said. I noted down the need for responsibility, accountability. We've been talking about the need to speak the same language between different sectors to create trust. So when you are designing something like the new Defense Innovation Accelerator, how do you go around these issues that we just talked about?
That's an excellent question, Bruno. Thanks a lot, and I think a lot of things to pick up on. Maybe let me make this point to start with, and this really relates to engagement with the private sector, speaking the same language, and so on and so forth. I think when we talk about doing innovation in an alliance context, this also means that we significantly need to change the way we do business. At the moment, the default way of doing business here is that we write a strategy, allies negotiate, we put a NATO restricted on it, and we put it into our NATO networks, and it never gets out of here. So I think with these new technologies, we need to take a fundamentally very kind of open approach, really. So that's what we tried to show already by publishing a summary of our AI strategy, which included the principles of responsible use, and really going out there and positioning ourselves in the kind of civilian and civilian environment. But this also means that we need to develop our mechanisms differently. So, for example, for the AI strategy, we organized industry roundtables to get inputs from different industries. When designing the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, we work hand in hand with accelerators across the Atlantic to red team our approaches. We've created an advisory group on emerging technologies, which brings in these kind of external experts from academia to provide us with advice on all of these different elements. So I think all in all, what this means is that if we want to succeed in the 21st century and maintain the alliance's technological edge, we need to leverage what we call the triple helix. So public sector, private sector, and academia, and really create this kind of all of society efforts. And I think this touches a little bit upon, first of all, something that Nico said, but then also Raluca said later, that technology today crosses around the military and the civilian realm. And I think this is really, I think you're really pointing out the real challenge here, because if we think about the strategic competition that we're in when it comes to technology, that's not something that we can solely solve in the economic environment, solely solve in the defense environment or social environment, and so on and so forth. It's really a whole of society effort, which obviously then touches upon questions of resilience and so on and so forth. But it also means that, for example, if we look at just one example at international standard developing organizations that have been a little bit in the dusty drawers for a very long time, we need to get them out of these dusty drawers and actually make them political issues again, because civilian standards are now also determining, well, our military capabilities and how far we'll be able to use these capacities in the future. The last point I want to touch upon was one that Joanna made. I think it was a really important one, and this is kind of bringing in the operator and the selection criteria for working with different projects. And I think here what's critical is that we put the needs of our militaries at the center of the whole thing. But this doesn't mean that putting the needs at the center of the whole endeavor doesn't mean that we need to describe the solution. I think we need to change our mindset here and go away from requirements towards problem sets and be open to receiving maybe solutions and ideas that we would have normally not received on these different solutions that we're looking for. I think what's critical for the success of this endeavor is that we don't have developers developing solutions in isolation, but bring in end users and from the operational side, from the service side, that actually provide continuous feedback to the development process and make sure that the technologies are really applicable to the environment that they are supposed to work in. So I would stop here. I hope I touched on the majority of questions, and back to you, Bruno. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you very much. I also perhaps wanted to see with Nikolas if you wanted to give a reaction to some of the things that were said, without obliging, but if you have some pressing thoughts, feel free.
Sure. Briefly, a few reflections here. One on, I mean, Diana and the NATO Innovation Fund at large. I think it's a great initiative. It's the right direction. You know, I applaud the alliance for having agreed on it. I'm looking forward to the formal launch, and especially also the definition of the problem set. I think Joanna pointed that really out nicely here to say, you know, devil's in the details. But I mean, the start and the setup is really promising. So kudos already for having come so far. What I found fascinating is when ASG Van Wiel said something around deep technology investments in one of his remarks in October, where he said, you know, this is something that's sort of underappreciated by industry, and, you know, NATO wants to sort of just accelerate that component and see how it can also fill potential like niche issues that are relevant for the alliance, but, you know, might not simply be recognized or worked on by industry. That's something that I look forward to see how that will play out in practice. The other point I wanted to make is around accountability, something that Joanna has pointed out rightly, super important. I think creating accountability happens almost automatically when you work on something together. Because once you don't feel responsible for something anymore, it's difficult to, you know, be held accountable to some certain degree, you know, putting legal considerations aside, but just about the mindset. So if you think about how to create and foster an environment where it's not just about finding the right ethical normative approach, but also making sure we remain accountable, is to make sure that we all feel there's something invested in this. And this brings us back to this whole of society or broader resilience point of view, to make sure that we understand this as an issue that has relevance for all of us. It's not just, you know, NATO in a way is becoming a little bit of a, I would even say like a platform in that sense. And that's something that is a new role. And for us in industry, civil society, it's also maybe a little bit confusing at times to see like, okay, but NATO has, you know, done their own thing. You know, they were kind of out there and in their closed circuit, and they knew what they were doing and focused with their tickable stakeholders. So we're really looking at a transition that will probably also change the face of the alliance and how it is publicly perceived. And that's an effort that will require a lot of, like, you know, outreach, making sure that people also appreciate what's going on within the alliance and, you know, with its partners across industry and civil society. I was tempted to throw out some numbers on, you know, what's happening in terms of investment, but I think I'm going to leave it at here for now. Maybe we have time later on, because it's fascinating to see what that actually means when we look back, for example, at the strategic concepts and what, you know, kind of investments took place then in that kind of year and compared to now. But again, I'm going to stop here quickly to give others a chance to comment as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nikolas. Yeah, it is a short panel. Unfortunately, we have about 15 minutes left. Joanna, Raluca, I will get back to you, but let me perhaps throw some questions in the mix that we got from the audience, and we can get back to the panel. So there's two questions right now on things that were, you know, already touched upon. One question is indeed, you know, how much attention human resources will receive in a new strategic concept. And perhaps Joanna, there, you know, you touched on these issues. Perhaps you have best practices or lessons learned. How to leverage this human capital, you know, how do we do that to develop the skills and the talents are needed? I don't know, perhaps if you can comment on that. And then there's another question for you specifically, Moritz. What are the practical things that the private sector can do to support the objectives of Diana and the Innovation Fund? So I don't know if, you know, I can reverse the order of how we started and get back to you, Joanna or Raluca. Who would like to kickstart?
I'm happy to give a brief answer to the HR question. I think Nikolas already touched upon it in terms of accountability, in terms of buy-in. I think when it comes to the human resources level right now, you've seen much of the military sector and defense sector be quite a closed-off community of people working. It's all, and it's not really been accessible. And I think part of that's due to citizenship issues, clearance issues. You know, there's multiple bureaucratic reasons as to why certain people, it's hard to get into it. As somebody who tried to for many years, my passports gave me huge issues. And that is coming from somebody who is very passionate about the sector and is also not, you know, the pay difference between private sector and these sectors can also be a significant driver. And I think part of the what somebody like NATO or what militaries need to do is start creating a cultural work environment that makes up. They're not going to be able to compete monetarily with the kinds of salaries that are there. But what you can compete with is the kind of work culture that you create and the kind of excitement around the kinds of projects that you get to use. And so I think when it comes to that, I see that the question itself refers specifically to the strategic concept and the strategic compass. I don't know if that is something that gets mentioned at that level, but from the practical side of how you implement, like I was saying, the devil's always in the details. When you're talking about how you're going to create organizational change and create a culture in which you have people being accountable to each other, that needs to be a safe organization. I think one of the key things about innovation, especially in a time like this where the change is so huge here, and change always brings fear of the unknown. It's a given, you can't avoid it. You need to create a safe environment, and hearing Maritz talk about the openness of it, I think is already a start. But when it comes to HR, there needs to be a huge push from the NATO side, but also from each of the individual militaries, departments of defense, on creating an attractive place to work. And that has its own issues, and I'm not going to go into the details of HR troubles when it comes to the military sector, but I think it also has an impact more broadly on the type of, when it comes to responsibility and accountability, is you need diversity. One of the key things about the accountability that I was talking to is that when you're a political military organization and you're talking politics, you're accountable to your population. You're not just accountable to each other, you're voted in democratic states, you're voted in by the people and you're accountable to them. So you have to be an organization that represents them. And if you don't have that diversity, you also run the risk of, exactly when you're developing dual use technologies, we're seeing too late the risks that these technologies run, because we don't have attractive enough HR and attractive enough workplaces when it comes to technology. So biggest one is facial recognition software. We found out far too late the flaws that were there, and that's partly because the diversity at the table where that conversation was happening wasn't there. Can NATO do something about that? Yes. Make it an easier workplace to get into for those that are passionate about NATO, because creating the need in the young professionals to want to go to NATO is all fine and good, but if you don't have an HR process and a system for employing people that allows them to get there, you're simply driving them to places where they can get a salary to pay their rent.
Raluca, I saw you nodding a lot. Would you like to add some thoughts to that?
Yes, definitely. I will actually zoom in more on the human-machine teaming element of some of these disruptive technologies and focus also on, I would say, people or soldiers, more from an HR perspective, and why, for instance, military personnel needs to also kind of adapt throughout the command structures, especially when it comes to working with or doing combat actually with AI-enabled machines, for instance. For this, I would say that in a battle phase where machine autonomy is increasingly assuming functions that are restricted usually to human intelligence or human beings, maintaining clear lines of human responsibility as well and accountability. So here again, to echo Joanna's point, are I would say highly relevant and highly important. But clarifying these issues, I would say start by improving ethical instruction when it comes to military personnel and military training and military educational institutions as well, that kind of build in some of these notions and transformations and disruptions. So I would say that focusing on military capabilities is one, but also focusing on inner capabilities such as virtue ethics, ethics during combat, as well as how, for instance, AI developers design some of these technologies in mind of their usability. And again, human-machine teaming is highly important. This will, I would say, make ethical guidelines when it comes to such scenarios better tailored for the battlefield of the future. And I would like to also add one point that wasn't mentioned during our discussions when it comes to successful defense innovation, because we tend to, again, focus on the, I would say, hype, the exciting stuff, the emerging disruptive tech, but how this emerging disruptive tech also gels with, sustained incremental innovation and legacy technologies is also quite important to consider nowadays. So, for instance, how AI-enabled technologies will provide you with an edge, indeed, in the future, but how, for instance, they will also fuse with other technologies, because AI is an enabling technologies from this perspective. But this is just one example. And my last point will be related to trust, and this coming from an angle, coming from an academic, and building trust, and also an environment or an ecosystem where academia, indeed science and technology organizations, the public and the private sector, civilian sector collaborate, especially when it comes to developing weapon systems, is something that is quite challenging, because academics, at least, and also some of the civilian private sector are not really inclined necessarily to join in. And we have seen some examples already in the United States. I won't go give examples of projects, but these are indeed some of the challenges, and that is why indeed shared responsibility, accountability, things that Joanna mentioned and Nikolas, are very important in introducing in the conversation. I'll stop here because of time, but thank you.
Thank you, Raluca. Maurice, let me get back to you. I know you already briefly touched upon it, but just to address the question from our audience, what are the practical things that the private sector can do to support NATO in the objectives of Diana and the Innovation Fund?
No, thank you very much, Bruno. And maybe before I touch on those, I just want two points. I think Joanna made an extremely important point with diversity regarding human capital. I think that's absolutely critical, that we become more diverse. There's a bit more of a kind of perspective also at NATO as a career. To touch upon one point that Raluca made on cooperation and the difficult cooperation when it comes to weapon systems, indeed, that's a problem. But let's maybe start with let's not start with weapon systems. Let's start with anything else before we come there. Let's build up this trust and take the time to build up this trust. And then on the question on basically what the sector has to do to be most helpful for Diana and the fund, I think it's a very good question. It's maybe a little bit of an early one, to be quite honest, because we haven't established these two new entities. So maybe let me try to escape this question by giving you some more general thoughts here real quick. I think first of all, for us, it would already be a success if we get more civilian innovators to think about security and defense. And I think there are some real cultural issues also within the alliance and across the globe as well. I lived for a while in Israel, for example, where the military is it's a very part of society. The same goes, for example, for the United States, where if you innovate, you think security and defense. It's not something that's completely out of your kind of scope and perspective. Whereas when we think about innovation in Europe, or at least in Germany, where I come from, it's very much linked to economic prosperity and to economic success. So there's less of a link here, less of a direct link between security and defense environment. So already here, I think, in which sense the private sector can be helpful for Diana is actually, well, to be open to this cooperation, to work together with us on problem sets, and also see this as an opportunity to actually get access to additional markets. The second point I would say here is that I think for the private sector to help us with Diana and for the NATO Innovation Fund is challenge us. Maybe propose a solution that we haven't thought about. Don't try to say, okay, that's probably what NATO would like to see. I think I would like to see solutions that we don't want to see. Maybe there's some solutions that are so blatantly obvious that we're simply not looking at them. So I think this would be my plea here: be unconventional and try to challenge us here and put solutions forward that we might not feel comfortable with at first sight. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Nikolas, I feel tempted to perhaps also turn the question around and ask, what practical things NATO can do to help the private sector to support Diana and the Innovation Fund.
Becoming unconventional sounds very exciting. Let's see how that plays out in practice, Moritz. I think this brings us back to, making sure that NATO understands what kind of new role it will play in this environment. this is, I mean, NATO in itself as an alliance is already a network, but this is now sort of a new kind of networking, a new kind of platform in that sense. So making sure that stakeholders across the board, small, medium, large enterprises, feel attracted to that platform, to explore, to see how their own thoughts and developments might relate to that. I think that's sort of the key theme, because there is an abundance of possibility space. Raluca had alluded to, you know, some of the geopolitical challenges out there, the competition, and I think NATO is not going to win the competition with budget. I mean, you know, Joanna's point on HR, yes, of course, salaries differ from the private sector to the public sector, but that's something that's, you know, it's not new in that sense. It exists in many other fields. I think it's really here about making sure that NATO understands the possibility here to become an interesting partner and finding collaborators who find it attractive and interesting to get something out of this, be it, you know, new business opportunities, but also just exploring different avenues of their own engagement or applications of their own products and services. So I think that's the big thing that would help industry to really engage with NATO within Diana or in whichever format beyond in the years to come.
Okay, and to round off, perhaps also to you, Joanna and Raluca, we've been talking a lot about, public-private cooperation, but, you know, the role of the academia, the civil society is also important. If we talk about unconventional ideas, it's usually the scientists that generate them as well. So maybe you have, you know, lessons learned or good practices on how to communicate bottom up, from civil society, academia to an institution like NATO.
Yeah, I'll go first. I think, in a closing remark, I can say the only way to truly figure out innovation is to get in the weeds, get in the mud and do it, right? And you can't think of everything that's going to happen before you get there. When it comes to communication, I think the lesson I've learned over the years is humility from all sides. You go into every conversation with humility, and I think the understanding that there is emotions involved. I think that is the one aspect that has, I think, been a barrier to some of the conversations I've seen between public and private sector, is that some of the conversations are so emotionally driven, and then it creates this huge barrier of we just can't talk to each other, and that is detrimental to both sides. And I think you see this happening with humanitarian sector and private sector, depending on who they partner with. And there's a lot of investment, because people when you're talking about defense or you're talking about conflict, you are in the end talking about people's lives. And so there is that emotion. So coming in with humility and respecting the fact that everybody at the table is passionate about what is happening, and then saying to each other, okay, how do we get this to move forward? And I think that's the only way forward, is through humble conversation, because we can all write strategic documents, we can write, all of the communiques, but it really is the people who are doing it who need to get into a room together, get into the weeds and start figuring it out. And that's the only way that you're going to achieve true innovation and cultural innovation, and really exactly what Nikolas was talking about, really get everybody together and working together.
Thank you, Joanna. And Raluca, the honor is yours for some final thoughts.
I will be super short as time is of the essence, but to echo again Joanna's point, I would say that indeed multi-stakeholderism plays a key role here, and having a seat at the table and also having your views heard is very important, not to end up into indeed an emotional Dostoevsky War and Peace scenario where different views clash at the table when it comes to perceptions. So in this regard, I would say that yes, this communication and interdisciplinary communication is essential, especially from computer science, STEM, but also humanities, social sciences as well. Another element that I would like to point out is also kind of meeting at both ends when it comes to innovation cultures, and also building in risk and failure, again, emotions, because I would say that the private tech sector operates through a different type of timing and logic, while the defense military military domain is very conventional, also in terms of who is buying what, in terms of some of the products or emerging technologies that will be produced. So that's one other element. And my last point would be indeed this difference between high politics, strategic, and very sometimes technical and opaque expertise-driven discussions surrounding some of these topics, as well as how these discussions are being communicated to, you know, citizens or the broader populations and the citizens of allies, because public support is one important issue here as well when it comes to some of these transformations. So yeah, I'm 1 minute ahead, sorry, Bruno, but thank you again for the conversation.
That's okay, and you know, we can allow ourselves to be a little bit over time when the conversation is interesting. But you know, I do congratulate you on the ideas that you shared. I apologize, there's no more time, but I think that, you know, we had a good tour de table on the issues at stake, and some interesting thoughts were formulated. I, for one thing, found it fascinating that a conversation about robots ends up being about human capital in the end. So that really testifies of, you know, the diversity of the topic and the interdisciplinary elements that we need to consider. So let me thank you again, dear speakers. Let me thank our partners at the US mission to NATO once again, and thanks to you, thank you, our digital viewers, for staying till the end. So goodbye, au revoir, and see you soon.